Once again, another year of highs and lows comes to a close. Watching the movies that came out in 2015, we laughed, we cried, we watched TV instead. Considering some of the gems that came out this year, can you really blame us? Now, I've always been an adamant supporter of film as an irreplaceable source of emotionally resonant and thought-provoking storytelling, but there were some flicks this year that challenged that notion. As we move toward 2016, it's time to take a look back at some of the movies that, well, many of us would rather forget. You're not going to see Jaws 19 on here, but I'm fairly certain that after enduring these, I would rather be watching that. First, though, we have some flicks that probably would have ended up on this list had I bothered watching them. These are the dishonorable mentions. Mordecai. Here's a suggestion for Johnny Depp. Instead of falling back on these caricature roles, why don't you try playing a human being for a change? There's a novel idea. 50 Shades of Grey. I sat through the Twilight Saga. I forced myself to stay awake during the host. I am not watching this. I draw the line at porn. Hot Pursuit. Sofia Vergara is easily one of the most annoying actresses around. Listening to her stereotypical routine for 90 minutes? I'll pass. Sorry, Reese Witherspoon. Pixels. Regularly insulting audiences' intelligence is bad enough, but tricking viewers by appealing to their nostalgia? That's a new low even for you, Sandler. Gem and the Holograms. Well, after Transformers and G.I. Joe were made into lackluster movies, they had to make another toy-based flick eventually. Paranormal Activity: The Ghost Dimension. There are so many entries in this series that I've lost track. Hopefully with this one, the franchise can finally be put to rest. Now, on to the main list. Number 10. Last Nights. Take a handful of cliches from a Ridley Scott historical epic and a martial arts flick, and you'll get something resembling this. An uninspired tale of retribution filled with forgettable characters and groan-worthy dialogue. The ornate sets, picturesque locations, and directorial prowess are admirable, but they're all wasted on a predictable story that you can see coming a mile away. Also wasted are the actors. What is Clive Owen doing here? I mean, I expected this from Morgan Freeman. He'll do anything nowadays, but Clive Owen? You'd think that after starring in a smart show like The Knick, he would have some higher standards. At least he doesn't phone it in. In fact, his passionate performance is easily the best part of the film. Unfortunately, his efforts ultimately prove futile, as he's surrounded by a collection of characters so underdeveloped that they're practically indistinguishable from each other. If you want to see Clive Owen swing a sword around, give King Arthur a shot. Number 9. Terminator Genisys. Do you remember how incredible the first two Terminator films were? They had compelling characters, exhilarating action set pieces, and a suspenseful, self-contained, and emotionally resonant story. This movie, not so much. It's easily the worst of the whole bunch. Admittedly, seeing Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the title role does have its charm, but his presence ultimately serves as one of the many, many reminders of days long past. The filmmakers attempt to pave a new path for the series by resetting the timeline a la Star Trek and X-Men, but the uninspired and derivative story that they come up with makes the franchise feel staler than ever. The writers spend so much time explaining this movie's existence and recycling concepts from previous films that there's little room for poignancy or thematic depth, which feels like a waste considering some of the ideas presented. Even more noticeable are the hit-or-miss performances. Jason Clarke is decent as John Connor, Jai Courtney is fine but miscast as Kyle Reese, J.K. Simmons is utterly wasted as a glorified plot device, and Emilia Clarke as Sarah Connor? I apologize for stating the obvious, but watch the first two movies again. Number 8. Insurgent. This is part of a trend that needs to stop. I'm tired of all of these adaptations of young adult novels with paper-thin allegories and ham-fisted social commentary. Instead of evolving into something more sophisticated, they're just getting worse and worse. And this movie perfectly typifies that. It seems like the writers went through a checklist of cliches that characterize this genre and threw them together into an unengaging story. The main character is the chosen one who challenges the system and wallows in teen angst. The snooty villain wants to crush the resistance and maintain the status quo, blah blah blah. Considering how formulaic this is, it's difficult not to admire Shailene Woodley for her emotionally charged performance. She tries her best, but much like Clive Owen, she's forced to work with a slew of characters so shallow and boring that it's nearly impossible to care about any of them. Aside from a few serviceable action scenes, there's little reason to watch this, as you've probably seen everything that it has to offer in other films. If you want a dystopian film with a much more effective use of social commentary, watch Snowpiercer.
Number 7.
Strange Magic. From the mind of George Lucas comes one of the most tone-deaf animated musicals in quite some time. While it certainly looks very pretty, this movie is an absolute train wreck that moves so quickly that you don't have time to digest anything that's going on. Nothing is given time to breathe, be it due to the juvenile comic relief or the breakneck pace. For all its talk of love and how important it is, the film seems to have no understanding of how much time it takes to develop. In this world, two people have a 5-minute conversation and then claim that they're in love. I'm not kidding. As a result, the talented actors turn in vocal performances that feel mostly devoid of direction. The filmmakers try to distract from this by throwing in a bunch of rock and pop songs, presumably to craft some sort of modern fairy tale. However, their inclusion in the movie feels like an afterthought, as most of these tunes come completely out of nowhere. We don't need lead-ins. We'll just pick some songs that sound cool and hope that people buy the CD. If you're looking for a fairy tale with a modern twist, revisit the first 2 Shrek flicks.
Number 6.
Jupiter Ascending. If there's one fact that this film cements, it's that the Wachowskis are not right in the head. How could any sane person give the okay on the concepts presented here? This is supposed to be a rousing space adventure filled to the brim with creativity. Well, there's definitely no shortage of ideas here, but the problem is that most of those ideas are so stupid and artificial that they take you out of the experience. For instance, we're told that bees are genetically designed to recognize royalty. I really have to applaud Sean Bean for keeping a straight face during that scene. Come to think of it, he and Channing Tatum are the only ones who give relatively decent performances. Mila Kunis and most of the other players are just bland and forgettable. Then there's Eddie Redmayne, who is so spectacularly awful that it's hard to believe that he's the same guy who did such compelling work in The Pillars of the Earth and The Theory of Everything. However, he can't be saddled with all the blame when you factor in the script, which is sloppy, repetitive, and rife with tedious exposition about a setting that we're given no reason to care about. If you need your fill of high-flying space thrills, stick with Star Wars.
Number 5.
Taken 3, or Take Threen as it's idiotically stylized. I'm going to come out and say that Taken should never have been a franchise. The first film was a reasonably engaging and suspenseful thriller that was elevated by the novelty of seeing Liam Neeson go radically against type. Unfortunately, not only has that novelty worn thin, but the series itself has morphed into something completely unrecognizable. It just seems like the filmmakers were obligated to make a third one of these without any understanding of why the first one worked. The plot is just ludicrous, featuring some of the most underwhelming twists of the series. However, much more noticeable is the fact that the story blatantly rips off The Fugitive. So, while my eyes are being assaulted by some of the most poorly directed action scenes of the year, I'm simultaneously being reminded of a far superior movie and, by extension, a far superior TV show. The cast must have known that too, because barely any of them look invested in what's going on. In fact, the only ones doing any sort of acting are Liam Neeson, Maggie Grace, and Forrest Whitaker. In case the point hasn't been made abundantly clear, skip this and go watch The Fugitive. If you want to see Neeson punching people, revisit the first Taken film.
Number 4.
Seventh Son. I love the fantasy genre. I love everything about it, from the exotic landscapes to the mythical monsters to the larger-than-life heroes. When done right, stories like this can really ignite the imagination and make audiences feel like they've journeyed to another world. This movie doesn't really do that, instead opting to be as unoriginal as possible. An unassuming farm boy destined for greatness is trained by a wise old mentor to defeat some evil despot. We've seen this story 100 times before, and it's tough to work up an interest in this version when nearly everything about it is so generic. Neither the world nor the characters are fleshed out in the slightest, lacking any dimension and existing only to move the plot along. Naturally, the talented cast is left with little to work with. Ben Barnes and Alicia Vikander are both painfully dull without a hint of chemistry. Julianne Moore's sneering villainy comes across as cartoonish, and Jeff Bridges is as annoying as ever as he does an insultingly bad Gandalf impression. If you need your fantasy fix, you might try the Middle-earth saga. As for the dude, stop mumbling and learn how to talk.
Number 3.
Outcast. Speaking of silly voices, we have another one, courtesy of Nicolas Cage pretending to be a crusader. Are you really surprised? Whatever credibility he gained last year with Joe is completely destroyed by the phony English accent and goofy demeanor that he puts on here. Even those who enjoy seeing him act like a maniac will be disappointed since he's not around for very long. Most of the time, we're stuck with Hayden Christensen's flat performance as he escorts a couple of one-dimensional characters from point A to point B. As was the case with Seventh Son, nearly every aspect of the plot is recycled, whether it's dealing with the Crusades or a dumbed-down version of China. As a result, the movie is a chore to sit through, which is shocking given how rushed it is. Not even the action scenes are enjoyable. They're all ruined by a barrage of Dutch angles and rapid cuts, making it extremely tough to tell what's going on. So, the film fails as both a historical drama and an action flick. For a more enthralling tale set in the Crusades, give Kingdom of Heaven a shot.
Number 2.
Fantastic Four, or Fant4stic if we're once again going by the poster. This movie endured numerous behind-the-scenes setbacks and relentless criticism from fans before finally limping into theaters in August. Alas, this is yet another case where the story behind the movie is more interesting than the movie itself. I don't presume to know how director Josh Trank's original vision would have turned out, but I can't imagine it being any worse than this. The script pitifully tries to weave together this grittier version of the Fantastic Four, only to fall flat on its pseudo-intellectual face. Everything about this film just exudes an utter lack of passion from the people involved. Never once did I get the sense that anyone wanted to be there. The performances are so lifeless that it's difficult to determine whether we're watching actors or robots. The set design is so devoid of color and spontaneity that the movie is downright depressing to look at. Most apparent, though, is the clear effect that the behind-the-scenes troubles had on the finished product. Why is there no second act? Why do the characters switch attitudes and motivations on a dime? Why does the film undergo a complete shift in style during the last half hour? The answer to all of these questions is simple. Instead of watching a movie, we're witnessing a disaster. A jaw-dropping blunder brought on by both studio interference and a filmmaker whose interpretation of the source material was just too radical. I can't believe I'm saying this, but watch the Tim Story Fantastic Four films. Yeah, they have a lot of issues, but they at least tried to have a bit of fun in their approach and felt more tonally appropriate for a superhero team called the Fantastic Four.
Number 1.
Barely Lethal. Of all the garbage that came out this year, none elicited quite the same seething anger from me as this. The movie, which looks like it was made on a budget of $5, attempts to blend the spy genre with the teen comedy, but it doesn't work in the slightest. The few action scenes that we get are so underwhelming and tensionless that they're hardly worth mentioning, and the humor is even worse. Over the span of this thing's 98-minute runtime, I never so much as chuckled. Most of the jokes you can see coming a mile away, and instead of being amusing, they're just juvenile to the point of disgust. Of course, it's when the movie tries to go for the self-aware stuff that it really becomes insulting. This script is entirely too stupid for that kind of humor, and the actors' attempts to convince you otherwise make the experience all the more uncomfortable. Haley Steinfeld capably handles the emotional scenes but has a tough time with the comedy. Samuel L. Jackson falls back on his typical shtick where he yells at everything. Sophie Turner is even more wooden here than she is on Game of Thrones, which is saying something. And Jessica Alba, with her condescending smirk, doesn't have an ounce of credibility as a deadly arms dealer. You know it's bad when the only performance with any charm comes from a Disney Channel actress. However, even Dove Cameron's relative likability can't save the film, especially since there's nothing of value to save. If you want a tongue-in-cheek take on the spy genre that goes all the way, watch Kingsman: The Secret Service. For a self-aware yet heartfelt take on the teen comedy, check out The Duff. While not perfect, it's a lot funnier and boasts a far more charismatic lead in Mae Whitman. As for this, don't even give it a second thought, as it truly is the worst movie that I've seen in 2015. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like, subscribe, and/or comment. Until next time.